leadership on Indian Standard Time. A little bit behind schedule again. Hopefully you understand the reasons for that and moving across here. So I'm going to hand over to Michael, and I'm actually now going to be ruthless on this 10-minute stuff, okay? So you have 10 minutes, Michael, and then your mic is going to be shut down. Andrew and Ian. But I'm looking forward to this because actually, you know, when you think about it, we have developed for over 100 years methods by which we track money. Business and finance have done a fantastic job on this. The accountants have done very well out of it. We know how to track money. And the influence of that money we've heard all the way through today, actually, up to now. You know, how do high-rise houses work and for whose benefit, etc. It's quite often money mediating the way. And so let's explore how business and finance actually contribute to the discussion that we still want to have, which is understanding relationally how things work.
Fine. I do have problems imagining you being ruthless, Jyoti.
I think welcome to the new me.
I've been friends for too long, but I will stick to the 10 minutes. I'm taking off my watch as symbolic. So I think you know the subject is finance and relationships. This is an enormous topic. I shall have fun doing it in 10 minutes. I will have a shot at introducing a few ideas into this. So, as you may have read in the introductory note I put forward, I fundamentally start with the point that that money is a very strong form of social bonding. And if you simply rely on altruism to build social bonds, you may be very disappointed because unfortunately we're not all as altruistic as we might like to think we are, and all kinds of factors come into play both between groups and between individuals that undermine our effort to build bonds purely through altruism. So money has always been, in all societies across history, a very powerful way of creating bonds. The question is, who does it create bonds between, and what kind of relationships are created? So if you take at one extreme debt, you have a relationship between a borrower and a lender, but it's not a relationship marked by parity. It's a relationship marked by power, where the lender often takes collateral for the loan, and the lender is generally in a very strong position relative to the borrower. That doesn't necessarily produce harmony in social relationships. By comparison, if I'm a shareholder in a very small local business, that may well facilitate my engagement with the person running the business and help to build a relationship which then has wider implications than simply the business in which the two people are engaged. So finance can create contact between people. It can mean people actually meet and talk across a city who would never otherwise meet and talk. And that can be true within an NGO or a church community or any other organization for that matter. Money provides an excuse for contact, and that may be in the context of a local retail market, or in the context of an NGO trying to deliver a public service or anything else. Think of St. John's Ambulance, for example, where people meet to help provide medical support. It can also produce common purpose. So take the Cambridge Building Society here in Cambridge, for example. So at the AGM, people who are lending money to the Cambridge Building Society and people who are borrowing from that building society could meet together and simply get to know each other as providers and users of those funds. I don't know to what extent that happens because I've never been to their meetings, but you can see conceptually why that might be true. And equally, it can produce mutual understanding. So wealthy people in Sheffield, for example, contributed to a thing we called the Sheffield Employment Bond. So this was the first employment bond that we issued. It raised just about £900,000 from the good people of Sheffield. Nearly 1,000 people contributed to that. And we then set up a fund which provided money, interest-free, no, not interest-free, it was 9% interest, but without collateral, that's the point, to local unemployed people who wanted to start businesses and who could not get that money out of a bank or a building society. The only way they could start a business was if somebody would give them effectively a grant or a loan. It wasn't a loan, it was meant to be repaid, to be able to start it. So here's a man who's been unemployed for 18 years, he came out of prison, he had 4 children, and for 18 years he'd had no job. He said he used at least £100,000 of state money. In the mid-1990s, that was quite a lot of money, and had produced nothing. He got a £3,000 loan from the money we created from the Sheffield Employment Bond, and that enabled him to start, buy a van, buy some tools, and start a small gardening business. So 10 years later, he was on Radio 4 in Britain and was interviewed by John Humphreys or somebody, and was asked, you know, what difference did this make to your life? And he said, well, of course, it transformed my life, because I now had the dignity of being employed. I was able to support myself and my family. I wasn't forever dependent on state handouts. I was able to look after my children. For me, it was completely transformative. Now, since then, over £53 million of these employment bonds have been issued. So this is a way by which the rich people in the city are able to contribute to the poor people in the city. Now, we made mistakes along the way. We found actually they needed a business mentor, these unemployed people, because in another case, somebody took a £12,000 loan, they set up a little bakery, but because they had no marketing skills, in the end they went bust. So we learned from our mistakes, but the point was local businesses started getting involved in this and putting in their money. They would then send representatives along, they got involved with some of the unemployed people, and relationships were built through this employment bond between different groups in the city that would never otherwise have physically met and never had that kind of shared understanding. So finance can destroy relationships too. If you borrow money from a local bank and you have difficulties repaying, often they're not terribly sympathetic and may force you to the wall as a small business. Or you may have a mortgage and the price of houses declines, as it sometimes does. You may be left with negative equity, and you may spend the rest of your life trying to pay it off, and having that loan actually ends up destroying your relationships. It also may create lack of parity. So if you're working in a supermarket, let's say in Tesco, and you're on the checkout, you probably know the figure here, but you have to work 500 years. You have to work for 500 years to get the salary of the chief executive of the supermarket chain. 500 years to get the annual salary of the chief executive of the supermarket chain. Now, the difficulty of these enormous pay differentials that we have now is that the wealthy live in one part of the city, the poor people live in the other part of the city, they go to work in different forms of transport, they go to holiday in different places, they might occasionally meet by accident in the lift, going to work, but as far as possible, people try, at least the wealthy people try and avoid that. So the trouble is, when do they actually meet? Money can create barriers between people in all sorts of ways. If the pay differential is 20 to 1, that's probably manageable, but at 500 to 1, you are in a different ballpark automatically. And equally, there is the acute problem that comes if you have shareholders trading their shares through a stock exchange. They may live in the same city that the business is located in, but no one knows who they are because it's anonymous trading through the stock exchange. And their interest in the company is only to make money out of it, not to engage with the people in the company. They never go to the AGM, they never meet the employees, all they do is trade it for profit on the stock exchange. So we have a maxim in relational thinking which goes like this. It really follows an American example, if you remember, no taxation without representation. So our maxim is no reward without responsibility, no investment without involvement, no profit without participation. That means if you're going to own shares, that's great. We love you to put your money up to help businesses grow. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. But we don't want you to put up shares without engaging with those who are using your money. And that engagement is what builds the relationships and creates connections. And ideally, we would like to see investment funds created, which will be simply for the city's employment potential. So we would want to see Milton Keynes set up an investment fund for investment in Milton Keynes, and we want to see the investors come from Milton Keynes and be able to go to the AGM of that company and meet the employees and the other stakeholders in that company and build relationships across the stakeholders in that particular city. That's the kind of vision that we would have for using money in a city context to build relationships among the different groups who would not otherwise have the opportunity to meet, by creating opportunities for connection and also creating opportunities for engagement and mutual purpose, what we call commonality. So my case study is from Alia, which was City Life, which I was part of the group that founded that back in 1996. They've now issued, as I said, £53 million of employment bonds. That's a bit of a cheat because part of that was a very large employment bond to Scotland, which the Scottish authorities wanted to use to build employment in Scotland, but at a city level we've done bonds in Sheffield, Newcastle and East London, and we've done multiple bonds in those cities in some cases. And then social enterprise centres, we have one here in Cambridge which provides a place for social enterprises to start up. We have 60 in the building, or Alia has 60 in the building in Cambridge, 80 in a building in Peterborough, and they're now constructing a future business centre, as they call it, down in East London, which will take 100. So the idea here is that one of the big problems of starting a social enterprise is finding somewhere you can work from where you don't have to buy or be liable for 3 years of rent in advance. Here you only have to pay, what used to be 1 month, I think it's now moved to 2 months. But they've managed to finance that through a Cambridge employment bond, where they're paying no interest on the money to the bondholder. They've managed to engage a lot of local companies with the whole idea through that employment bond, and then they've got the rest of the money from a bank which they're servicing through the rents they get from the social enterprises. So it is a commercial proposition. And then you can have social bonds through stock exchanges, the stock exchange where the British Stock Exchange has now finally, after 5 years of debate, allowed local charities to raise money through the stock exchange in 5, 7, 10-year bonds, which are traded on the stock exchange. That's another story, I won't go there. Just lastly, my last slide, to reassure you, Jyoti. So we talk about relational companies. Relational companies have 3 main characteristics. They have a social purpose, not just to maximize profits for shareholders, but to do something more than that, defined as a social purpose. Secondly, they are built as far as they can be, and it's often a process of moving towards this, on those principles I mentioned: no reward without responsibility, no investment without involvement, and no profit without participation. And thirdly, they are committed to stakeholder relationships which are measured and reported upon. Now, there's a long paper on that. If anyone's interested, they can talk to me. Secondly, we talk about shared equity housing. This is the idea that instead of taking a mortgage from a bank, where you get the full uplift of the property value if there's an appreciation in the property value, or you take the full hit if the property value comes down, rather than that, you have a financial institution that says, look, we will buy a percentage of the house. We will buy, let's say, 90% of the house and you have 10%. So 90% of this house belongs to us and you pay rent on the 90%. Instead of paying interest on a mortgage, you pay rent on the 90%. And then you can buy a percentage of the house every year, 3%, 5%, whatever you can afford, you buy it off us. As you buy more of the house, your rent goes down because you're paying rent on less and less of the house. And therefore you may buy the house over the same period, 20 years, but during that time you have a shared ownership of the house with the financial institution. Now that means you can meet the financial institution and decide for the next year how much of this property you're going to buy, and on an annual basis you revalue the house to see how it's going. And lastly, I've mentioned it already, the local investment fund, and I will stop there to keep to the ruthless Jyoti's timekeeping. Thank you, Jyoti.